Rome moved grain by sea, 1,000 ships a year, crossing open water, feeding 1 million people who never grew a single stalk of wheat themselves. But 400 years after Rome fell, on the other side of the world, a different empire faced the same problem and refused the sea. China didn't have a Mediterranean. It had two great rivers running east to west, never touching, and a population center that kept drifting north, away from its own food supply. So China's engineers did something almost incomprehensible. They dug a river, by hand, 1,100 miles of it, connecting a harvest in the south to a capital in the north that could no longer feed itself. They called it the Grand Canal, and by the time it was finished, it was moving more grain to more people over a longer distance than Rome's entire imperial fleet ever did. This isn't really a story about China. It's the same story as Rome, told with a different tool. Every large civilization hits the same wall eventually. The people in charge and the food they need stop living near each other. Rome solved that with ships and a coastline. China built its own coastline out of dirt and forced labor and locks that had to be invented before the canal could function. Same problem, opposite answer. And the one that came second arguably worked longer. Start with the geography, because the geography is the crisis. China's food grew in the south along the Yangtze Basin, rich soil, enormous rice harvests. But China's power lived in the north, eventually in Beijing, close to the frontier, far from any farmland that could feed it. A capital needs soldiers. Soldiers need grain. And the grain was up to 1,300 miles away, with no river connecting the two. Overland transport couldn't do it. A cart pulled by oxen might eat more grain crossing that distance than it delivered. Water was the only math that worked. So, across centuries and multiple dynasties, engineers linked rivers and man-made channels into one continuous waterway until barges could move rice from a paddy near Hangzhou to a granary near Beijing without a wagon ever touching the road. Here's what the logistics framing hides. That canal didn't flow downhill the whole way. Rivers do. A canal forced across hundreds of miles of uneven terrain does not. At its highest crossing point, the canal climbs roughly 40 meters above sea level, then comes back down. A loaded barge cannot simply flow uphill, so they built locks, sluice gates that raised and lowered the water in stages, letting a barge climb a staircase of water instead of a hill of earth. A gate closes behind the boat. Water rises, the boat floats up, a gate opens ahead. Repeat that dozens of times, and a rice barge could cross terrain that should have stopped it completely. Now picture the person actually operating one of those gates, not the emperor who ordered the canal built. A lockkeeper, a minor official, often stationed for years at a single gate, timing the water so grain barges moved through in order without stranding a boat halfway up the staircase, with the harvest rotting inside it. Multiply that by the hundreds of checkpoints along 1,100 miles, and you see the real machine. Tax collectors calculating what each province owed, boat trackers hauling barges upstream by rope, registrars logging every shipment, because a missing barge in the capital wasn't an accounting error. It was a famine, arriving in slow motion. These are the names history rarely keeps. But the canal didn't run on the emperor's authority. It ran on thousands of these people every day, getting the water level exactly right. And for a while, it worked at a scale that's hard to comprehend. At its peak, the Grand Canal moved an estimated 400 million liters of grain a year toward the capital, with grain fleets exceeding 1,000 vessels annually on its northern stretches, outpacing what Rome's entire Mediterranean shipping lane achieved for a single city. But a system this precise carries a weakness built into its precision. Rome's vulnerability was the sea itself: storms, piracy, a bad harvest season. China's vulnerability was smaller, and in some ways worse. The canal only worked if the water stayed at the right level, everywhere, all the time. Silt built up constantly, or barges ran aground. Droughts dropped the water too low to pass, and the canal crossed the Yellow River at one especially fragile junction, a river infamous for changing course entirely, sometimes abandoning its bed within a matter of years. When that junction failed, it didn't delay one shipment. It could sever the entire spine connecting south to north. A capital of hundreds of thousands, suddenly waiting on a repair crew instead of a harvest. And it did fail, more than once. Floods breached the route, silt closed stretches for months, and northern garrisons felt the strain before anyone in the capital admitted there was a problem. Each time, the fix wasn't a new idea. It was more labor, more dredging, thrown at the same 1,100 miles because there was no alternative route. One artery to feed the empire and no backup. That's the trade every civilization makes when it solves distance with infrastructure instead of geography. Rome's ships could reroute around a storm. China's canal could not reroute around a flood. The same engineering that let a harvest travel 1,000 miles also meant that capital depended on strangers it would never meet, keeping one single line open. This is why the comparison matters more than the trivia. A city that has outgrown its own food supply is not a city anymore. It's a bet placed every day on a system nobody in it controls. Rome bet on open water, China bet on a controlled channel. Both paid off for centuries, longer than most governments last today, and both eventually came due. The Grand Canal still exists, one of the oldest continuously used pieces of infrastructure on the planet. But somewhere between a lockkeeper timing his gate and rice reaching a granary 1,000 miles north, the illusion of a self-sufficient capital was always exactly that, an illusion, held up by people whose names never made it into the history books. You live in a city right now that has made the exact same bet, whether it was a coastline, a highway, a rail line, or a pipeline. Somewhere, someone you will never meet is timing a gate, driving a route, or checking a gauge. And the only reason you've never had to think about where your next meal is coming from is that so far, they haven't stopped.